we've gone out and we've taken a look kind of globally as to what's going on in the creek and have a set of solutions that are pretty much standard for something you'd see this kind of erosion going on. Having to do with you've got to do some things in the creek to change the energy patterns, and then you need to do something to make sure there's no more movement or no more erosion. So that still stayed the same. We haven't done anything else more globally like that. We're in the process of kind of looking at every stormwater issue we had throughout the district. So there are a few more steps we probably will take in the near future. Since buyout of homes are a possibility, you'll probably see in the not too near future we might have an appraiser come out here and just kind of do a windshield look at the properties and kind of give us a reality check against the information that's in the assessor's office, just to give us a feel for some property values and that type of stuff. The other piece that we don't really have is some information on the structural strength of the soils that remain, that are being eaten away. So one other activity we might in the near future be asking for is access to the backyards of some of the properties. It brings in a small rubber tire type rig that goes down and it drills a 4-inch hole and it grabs samples of the soil. And then we can run tests on the soil to see how stable it will be, depending on what it is we have to do. As far as the geomorphology and the way hydrologically this creek works, we've pretty much got all the information we need. There were previous studies done by Intuition and Logic as part of a study of the overall area. We've taken a look at the details as to what's there, and so that information's all kind of set up until we do any kind of detailed design of any kind.
I have one question.
Yes.
Over time, as you look at any possible solution here, the water flow over time, I guess, with all the construction and the way things, the runoff and the power and the energy over time type thing, will that change over time? Do you look at that, or do you say, well, it's as bad as it's going to get, or it's getting better, or?
There's a gap, and it's not always easy to tell. There's two things that can be going on with the creek. One is you can have increased flows because there was a period when everybody built and there were no controls. Primarily with the creation of the district, the Metropolitan Sewer District in 54, and building up to that, there's a lot of controls that go on. So every time somebody puts a development in with paved areas, there's detention or there's a way to capture the flow so you don't increase the flows. So that's one thing that goes on. Another thing that goes on, and I think this is something we mentioned earlier, is creeks naturally, you can go to a creek out in a farmer's field and you'll find erosion. And that's because creeks can naturally, what they'll do is where they're at now isn't where they always stay. They tend to do this within a swath. I think we mentioned earlier, taking it a very, kind of looking back decades ago at this creek seems to have a pathway that it stays in. It's done no major cutting a long bow off or redirecting itself around the washout, around a bend. It stayed pretty much in the same place, but the banks do this within a corridor. And it seems like that's more what's going on here. It's really difficult to tell, is it increased runoff part of it? Probably it is, but in general, neither one of those is significant enough to really throw our calculations off, and we think there's a way to, the creek is telling us I got to lose energy. This is where it happens to be doing it. That helps us. It isn't always the best way you want to find out that it wants to lose energy, but as it reacts and as we see it move, that gives us more information too to say, okay, is there a way to make sure we can let that energy dissipate and still, obviously because our homes here, try to stop the movement of the creek. Out in a natural creek like this, oftentimes over 50 years, 100 years, you might see a creek like this just kind of snake its way down boundaries on either side. And that is partially what's probably going on here. If you guys have seen the aerial views, you see how this thing naturally does those type of moves. In the old days, people would straighten those out, and then you cause a whole lot of problems. Fortunately, you still got the normal creek. You don't have a big cut-off. So it's probably a mix of the two, but there is a piece in here of this creek wanting to do this naturally anyway. So we're pretty convinced that we've got some pretty good aerial photos as to what the global issue is, and at least globally how to satisfy it. The hard part will be in the details, but that's a piece. We haven't started yet. Jeff was mentioning the funding comes later. Even the funding for detailed design of this type of thing isn't in place. It's just kind of planning data that we're collecting now. It's going to be a while. Some of it depends on how what the board proceeds with and how the dollars start coming in. As far as how fast we go, we'll gather this information over the next 7, 8, 9 months. As summer approaches, springtime is always a good time to see how it reacts. We've gone out and taken a look. We've got rain gauges, and we know what has happened out here and what hasn't moved, and what kind of storms you've had and stuff. So it's just kind of data we're gathering here, just like we do throughout the rest of the district.
One thing we feel strongly about is we've done sort of preliminary work, but before you spend several $1 million, you're going to do detailed engineering, and so and that kind of money doesn't really even become available till, assuming a stormwater rate starts in March, we start seeing payments in April. So we got a little time left before we'll have dollars to start devoting. But
so do you have dollars available to start the analysis to get your requirements together, or is it?
Well, some of what Brian talked about is sort of preliminary, maybe first steps.
So you got those,
we can do some of
Just
that.
it's touch work that we're doing, especially out in the county where there's no funds collected.
Gotcha.
There is a general stormwater planning that goes on, which in some cases is no more than looking at the aerial photograph, having a guy go out for 4 hours and logging in there. Something needs to be done here. That's about as much detail as we're doing throughout. We're doing a little bit more here because of the severity and trying to gather, within the limited funds we have, gather some more information.
One of the things, I don't know, were you at the first meeting that we had?
I'm not sure. I've been spotty on some.
In the house here? Yeah,
In the house. I don't
No.
think you were able to make it that
Okay.
day.
Yeah, we didn't meet. You weren't here for that one.
Just to fill in the blanks, one of the things we want to be very careful about is whatever our solution is, and right now we think it's probably what we talked about last time. Our opinion hasn't changed. Probably some houses are going to have to be taken out, and there's going to have to be a reshaping of the land. But the things we want to be very careful about is a solution that moves the problem. We could find ourselves spending a bunch of money and then creating another disaster somewhere else, and so hence the detailed design work that's going to happen.
So the energy still has to come out here, but because you don't want to move down, obviously.
It has to happen somewhere.
Right.
And there's no way to know. I mean, you can draw conclusions, but until you build it, whatever it is, you have to be really careful about what it is. You want that energy loss to continue to be probably here.
These are fairly new type of analysis, and they're really much more in art than they are science right now.
I was just going to ask, so if you do this correction, whether it's a bank gradient, whatever, so we don't have any numbers as far as, obviously if you haven't been doing it for 50 years, you don't know how it stands up over 50 years, right? So we feel pretty comfortable that if you do that, that's...
If we can be successful, and Brian, you're going to have to make sure I don't screw up here, if we're successful in stopping the forces that are at work here and vegetating the reshaped land, it'll end up being...
So the last 5 years, it may last 100 years.
Oh yeah, it'll naturally sustain itself.
Okay.
And and it won't reoccur, and it won't move downstream. I mean, we'll be successful